Today we're taking a look at the development and release of the Nintendo GameCube, and this story kicks off in 1997, just after the launch of the Nintendo 64. So as I mentioned in the last part, SGI, or Silicon Graphics, who's the company that Nintendo worked with to create the Nintendo 64, were just falling apart at the seams internally, so Nintendo could see this going on from the outside, and they didn't want to partner with them again for their next console, which would become the GameCube. So instead, they had two other companies that also both formed in 1997 to choose from. So the first company that Nintendo were looking into was a company called CagEnt, and they were previously known as 3DO Systems, and they produced the 3D chip for the 3DO console that I've got right here. So in some ways, the GameCube could have been a spiritual sequel to the Panasonic 3DO. So in 1995, 2 years before CagEnt was formed, the 3DO Systems team had actually made a follow-up chip for the original 3DO called the M2. Originally this was actually going to just be an attachment to the 3DO, but they ended up turning it into a brand new console. The M2 was actually demonstrated at E3 1995, and it had similar power to the Sega Saturn, but it was a lot easier to program for. In December that year, 3DO actually sold their M2 chip technology to Panasonic, who would then go on to create their own M2 console. And then in April 1996, Panasonic made a brand new division called Panasonic Wondertainment, and that Wondertainment division ended up beginning creating their own M2 console, which would have actually had DVD playback in 1997, so it was way ahead of its time. And interestingly, I also found this concept picture here, and the controller looks almost identical to a Nintendo 64 controller. There was also rumours around this time as well of Sega actually acquiring the M2 technology and not Nintendo, so there is an alternate reality out there where the Dreamcast is actually made using the 3DO M2 chip instead. But in 1997, Panasonic decided to cancel the M2 console completely because they were worried about too much competition from Sega, Sony, and Nintendo, who all had their own brand new consoles out at the time. Konami did go on to use the M2 chip in some of their arcade boards though, so it wasn't all for nothing. So Panasonic owned the rights to the M2 chip technology and to the console creation features, but 3DO still owned its own hardware division, and it was that hardware division that was sold to Samsung in 1997 that would then become CagEnt. And then CagEnt, using their understanding of chip manufacturing and hardware manufacturing, they created a third brand new chip called the MX chip. And this wasn't just a chip, this was a full console design that was ready to be licensed by other manufacturers, such as Nintendo or Sega. And it was this new MX chip technology and all of the other surrounding technologies that Nintendo was interested in. So of course, this sounded perfect for the successor to the Nintendo 64. So talks begin with CagEnt, and Nintendo employees went over there to visit the team while Nintendo's legal division was trying to figure out a way of buying the technology from Samsung. So while the talks were going on about the sale of the company and the technology, the developers were actually already planning on sending out dev kits to some of Nintendo's biggest developers, including Rare and Intelligent Systems, and this was way back in 1997-1998. And they were targeting a launch date of this new console for August 1999. So it seemed like everything was going smoothly and it wouldn't be too long until Nintendo's next home console hit the market, but unfortunately, as the developers were getting ready to send out the dev kits and the plans were being finalised, Samsung decided to cancel the sale to Nintendo, and instead, a few months later, they actually sold the technology to Microsoft. So with that blow to Nintendo's future, they were back to the drawing board, and luckily, there was one other company that they could reach out to, so let's find out who they were. So let's rewind back to 1997 now and take a look at the next company. This one was called ArtX, and this one was actually set up by some former SGI employees. It was founded by Tim Van Hook, who was the Chief Technical Officer, and Dr. Wei Yen, who was the former head of Nintendo operations. They were the chief designers of the N64 processor and the architecture of the Nintendo 64 as well. The two founders had managed to recruit more SGI employees and start their own graphics company. These employees made the break from SGI to try and keep up with the changing trends in the tech industry at the time, while SGI was floundering because Windows was taking over a lot of their market share. And one of the first things that this new company did was actually start working on a brand new game console chip. in the hopes that someone would buy it off them in the future. Unfortunately though, just around the same time, SGI would actually file a non-compete lawsuit against ArtX, claiming that their new startup was using some trade secrets from SGI. So 1 year after ArtX's founding, in April of 1998, after the collapse of the talks with CagEnt, Nintendo reached out to ArtX to try and form a collaboration. And a bit later on the 28th of May, SGI actually dropped all of the charges against them, probably in fears that they would lose against Nintendo. So in the end, Nintendo ended up cutting all ties with SGI just like they hoped, but they managed to retain all of the previous staff from the Nintendo 64 days. So finally, this looked like it would be the perfect transition from the previous generation to the next. But there was a lot of work to be done if they wanted to still make that 1999 release date. So now we're moving over to 1999, and at the start of 1999, March 2nd to be precise, Sony announced the PlayStation 2, and this was Nintendo's kick up the bum to finally announce their sequel to the Nintendo 64. So just a few days later, on March 9th, Nintendo first announced that they were working on a brand new next generation video game console. And on March 13th, IGN released a big article all about Nintendo's new console, with a lot of details about the specs of the new ArtX chip as well. And interestingly, this is also the first time when we heard the first name for what would end up becoming the GameCube. It was originally called N2000. And in this article, we can find out a few interesting bits of early history about the GameCube. We can find out that the release date had been pushed back from 1999 to a new release date of October 2000. But even at the time, some employees at Nintendo didn't think this would be feasible. They also announced some of the initial specs that ArtX had told them, including the fact that it would be a 128-bit system with a 400 MHz processor codenamed Gecko, and with an ArtX graphics chip. It would also not be compatible at all with the previous MIPS chip from the Nintendo 64, and also break in compatibility, and finally, in a lot of people's eyes, Nintendo was finally moving away from cartridges into a new disc-based format. Something else really interesting, which didn't end up coming true, I don't think at least, and I don't even know if this is possible today on a home console, but they were actually looking into making a NURBS translation program for the GameCube. So basically, NURBS is a way of modelling in 3D that doesn't use polygons, so you get really nice rounded shapes, and I know that Rare used it in all of their promotional material, and a lot of the renders that were made using the Silicon Graphics technology also used NURBS, and the end result is incredible, and it still looks incredible today. So imagine being able to play a game at that fidelity without the obvious polygonal elements to it. I don't think that ended up happening, but correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I just thought it was really interesting to read. And interestingly as well, at the time of this announcement, they hadn't actually decided whether the discs for the GameCube would be full-size DVDs or the mini discs that they ended up going for. A few months later, it was time for E3, and on May the 12th at Nintendo's E3 conference, the day before the event opened, they finally announced the name of their next console, and it was called Dolphin. They didn't show off any games or the design of the console at this show, but they did make a few more announcements. They announced that it was going to be a powerful system, but it was also going to retail for a mass market price. They announced that ArtX was going to be designing the graphics chip, which was codenamed Flipper, and they reiterated that it would be running on an IBM CPU. They also stated that it would be using DVD technology patented by Panasonic. They also mentioned that the Panasonic technology for the discs would also be integrated in their own products, as well as Nintendo, so that explains where the Panasonic Q came from a bit later on in the console's life, and I really wish I had one. It just looks absolutely phenomenal still to this day. But that was it for Dolphin announcements at E3. There was no games shown off, and it wasn't anywhere to be seen on the show floor either. But in the background in 1999, development kits were finally being sent out to some first and second party developers. And here's a look at some of those early Dolphin dev kits, and we can see the official Dolphin logo on these as well. I remember seeing these dev kits and logos in magazines at the time and thinking that it was just so exciting that we were going to be getting a brand new Nintendo console, and I just could not cannot wait. They basically resemble PCs with Gamecube controller ports on them, and later on, there would also be special dev Gamecube consoles, which had slots in the top for a hard drive, where developers could actually switch between 5 or 6 games in real time on the system to test out different builds. And all of these dev kits actually only run on special development CDs, so you can't actually play regular Gamecube games on them, and you can't run development discs on a regular Gamecube either. So throughout 1999 and 2000, developers were getting their hands on the technology for the first time, and literally getting their hands on this technology as well, because I found some really fascinating looks into the first prototype versions of the controllers, and let's take a look at some of them now. So the first test controller here, which was sent out with 1999 versions of the dev kits, is literally nothing more than a PCB and some buttons on top to replicate pressing the buttons on the controller. And then in early 2000, the first official controller design was sent out to developers. This one's called DevKit Controller version A, and there's some really interesting differences here between this and the final release. So instead of having a D-pad on the left handle, it actually has a menu button. And it also has really long, almost Virtual Boy-like controller grips. And a different B button as well, which is actually shaped in the same way as the X and Y buttons, but it's in the position of the B button in the corner. And as well as that, the analog stick itself is also much bigger than the final release too. Here's the second revision of the controller that was sent out in mid-2000. This is version B, and you can see some very interesting differences here. So they had a D-pad finally added to the controller here, and it also has a start and pause button in the middle. It still has the wrong B button though, and it still has that big analog stick. And as you can see, there's different versions of this as well, with different speeds. And these refer not to the speed of the game itself, but to the polling speed of the controller and the associated dev kit. So as the dev kits were being built, the actual speed that the controller could be read by the computer was also increasing, so they released different versions of controllers which were compatible with different versions of the dev kit. Interestingly, around this development time, there's actually a leaked document that came from the GigaLeak to suggest that Nintendo was actually looking into making the GameCube more of a portable hybrid console, kind of like what the Switch ended up becoming, including the ability to actually dock it into the TV and take it on the go and use a flip-up LCD screen to play the games that way too. A lot of people have speculated that this was dropped because of the power consumption and the fact that the battery wouldn't be able to last very long in portable mode, but it's really interesting to see that Nintendo was entertaining the idea of a portable hybrid console all the way back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Another interesting dropped feature from the development of the GameCube is the fact that they actually intended it to have a stereoscopic 3D display as well, which I assume also comes from this portable version of the system, and Nintendo themselves have actually stated that the LCD screen would have had Glasses 3 3D technology, kind of like what we saw later on the 3DS as well. And Luigi's Mansion was actually built originally with 3D stereoscopic technology in mind, which is a really cool, fascinating insight into how far back some of Nintendo developments actually go before they see the light of day. And in April 2000, there was some exciting news for ArtX as well. They were actually bought out by ATI, who was a big computer chip manufacturer at the time. And they were actually bought out for $400 million, all in ATI's big push to get into consumer technology. And from that point on, ATI became business partners with Nintendo, and there's actually a flipper chip here from 2000 with ATI's logo on it. And if you've ever paid attention to the GameCube, you'll actually see that ATI's logo is actually there on the front of the system as well. One of those developers that got the early dev kits was a brand new studio that was funded by Nintendo called Retro Studios. And at first they were working on 4 games for the Dolphin, including a game called Raven Blade, an American football game, an action-adventure game, and a car combat game as well. But Miyamoto visited the company in early 2000 and he wasn't very impressed with what he saw. So what he did in order to turn Retro Studios into one of Nintendo's most important developers is actually buy out the rest of Retro Studios from the founder to make them a second-party developer, and told them to start working on a brand new game in the Metroid series instead. And at that point, all of their other projects got cancelled and they were focusing exclusively on making Metroid Prime for Nintendo's upcoming system. One of Nintendo's goals, and ArtX's goal as well, was to make this system as developer friendly as possible, because Like I said in the last video about the Nintendo 64, it was extremely difficult to develop for, and Nintendo lost the trust of a lot of third-party developers at the time, so they made sure that the GameCube was as easy as possible for developers, and they made some brand new pipelines in order to make that a reality. Then it was time for E3 2000 on the 11th to the 13th of May, and Nintendo was there showing off all of their latest N64 games, but there was barely any mention of the Dolphin. In fact, it was only mentioned for one slide during their entire press conference. But it wasn't completely devoid of Dolphin-related news though, because some of the N64 games at the show would actually end up being cancelled for that system and moved across to the GameCube instead. So we saw our first glimpse of games like Resident Evil 0, Eternal Darkness, and Dinosaur Planet, which would go on to become Star Fox Adventures, all of which were originally N64 titles, and it's really interesting to see how they looked before they were moved over to the next generation system. Nintendo of America's marketing director at the time though did say that the Dolphin was still scheduled to come out in 2000. They did say to look forward to Spaceworld that year though, when the Dolphin would finally be shown off to the public. And that's exactly what they did on August 25th, 2000. So at the Spaceworld show, finally everything was revealed. They had this incredible stage show where people brought out GameCube consoles to show off and have photos taken with them. The name Dolphin was dropped and the name GameCube was introduced. They showed off the system and the controllers for the first time. And here we can see the first look at what would become the final revision of the controller. Everything looks exactly the same as the final release, apart from that B button still doesn't have its final rounded shape. There was one interesting difference with this Spaceworld version of the console though, compared to what ended up coming out. It actually has a little opening at the top where you could actually see the disc spinning around inside. And I actually really like this. I'm kind of sad they got rid of that. And interestingly, a Spaceworld version of the console was up on eBay a few years back. It didn't end up selling, but they were trying to ask for $100,000. This was also the event where they first showed off the Game Boy Advance as well, and they were talking about the connectivity between the two consoles at this show too. They also announced at this event the introduction of the mini-disc format instead of DVDs, and showed off the Wavebird controller, their wireless controller, for the first time too. And I think it was clear at this point that the console wasn't coming out in 2000, so they announced release dates for Japan and America of July and October of 2001 respectively. There weren't actually any playable games at the show, but there was plenty that was shown off in video form. Here's what they showed at Spaceworld 2000. They showed a demo of Luigi's Mansion, which looked incredible for the time. They showed off Mario 128, which is a very famous tech demo. A lot of people think that it's like a lost 3D Mario game, but it was nothing more than a tech demo to just show off the power of the GameCube and how many different objects it could have running on the screen at one time. And it was a great showcase for the system, and it's a really fun presentation to watch. So if you do have the time, definitely check the link in the description to watch the full show later on, because I really enjoyed watching it while I was researching for this video, and a lot of the stuff they showed off back then still seems kind of impressive today, honestly. They also showed off Meowth's Party, which was like a Pokemon showcase for the system, showing off how many different objects could go around on the screen at once, and showing off the sound capabilities of the console too. There was also the first look at Wave Race Blue Storm, and the new Star Wars game for the system too, and also a first glimpse into Metroid Prime, which looks very different to the final release. And just like the N64, Nintendo can't help but tease a new Zelda title too. So at the end of this demonstration here, they also showed off this really realistic looking demo of Link and Ganondorf fighting, which of course was very different to what Wind Waker would end up looking like just a year later. Spaceworld wouldn't be the final show of 2000 for the GameCube though. It was also showed off in November that year at a show in Las Vegas called Comdex. And this was actually an electronics show, and Nintendo weren't at the event themselves, but ATI was. And ATI showed off the GameCube here, along with a breakdown of the circuit board, because this was more of a technology show. But the most interesting thing about this version of the GameCube that was showed off here, it actually shows off an older version of the controller, one of those dev kit versions. Then there was radio silence until May of the year after, and it wasn't until E3 in May 17th to 19th, 2001 that the public could finally get their hands on playable versions of some of these games. And the full Nintendo press conference for E3 2001 is available to watch online, and it was so cool to see the crowd being so excited for Super Smash Bros. Melee. I remember being really excited when I first saw that as well. As well as that, they also showed off some Luigi's Mansion gameplay, and they had a demo of the Wavebird controller. They also showed off that same GameCube demo that they showed at Spaceworld the year before, as well as Donkey Kong Racing, which was a game that I was so excited for, and I'm so sad that that never came to see the light of day. And they also showed off Pikmin for the first time as well, and this is where we heard that some of the textures were taken from areas around Shigeru Miyamoto's home and garden and the surrounding area, which I always thought was really exciting, and Pikmin went on to become one of my favourite Nintendo properties ever. So it was really great to see where it got its start at this show, and people seemed really confused by the concept at the time as well, which is kind of funny in hindsight. Another game by Rare that they also showed off at E3 was the original GameCube version of Cameo, which of course got cancelled on the GameCube, moved to the Xbox, and then moved again to the Xbox 360. So it's again really interesting to see where this game got its start as well. And they also reiterated the launch dates for Japan and America, this time being set to September 14th, 2001 for Japan and November the 5th for the United States. One more show before the GameCube finally launched, and that was Spaceworld 2001, also Nintendo's final ever Spaceworld show. There was Smash Bros, Eternal Darkness, Cubivore, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Animal Crossing E+, which was an enhanced version of the N64 game, which came out in Japan just a few months prior, Wave Race Blue Storm, Star Fox Adventures, Super Mario Sunshine, Zelda the Wind Waker, who actually had its first showing at Spaceworld that year as well, and a lot of people were very mad about the new cel-shaded graphics, as I'm sure you'll remember if you were around at the time. But for me, the most interesting game shown off at this event was unfortunately also cancelled, and that was Kirby's Tilt and Tumble, which would actually use the GameCube and Game Boy Advance connectivity to allow you to actually rotate the game using the Game Boy Advance, and you would drop down certain parts of the level and end up on the Game Boy Advance system. And I was so excited to play this game, and I'm very upset that it never came out. And they also announced that the release date in the US would be changed from November 5th to November 18th. Now we're moving into September of 2001, and this time Nintendo made sure there was enough consoles for everyone, so unlike the shortages that they'd experienced throughout all of their previous releases, this time they actually had 450,000 systems ready to go on day one, along with 3 launch games. They were Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, and Wave Race. And Super Monkey Ball is interesting because that's actually Sega's first ever third-party release outside of their own home consoles. And the console was actually only available in this indigo purple colour. And for the first month on sale, they were the only 3 games you could get, and obviously the public was a little bit worried that this was going to end up being a repeat of the N64, where they went months and months without any new games. It wasn't until over a month later when Japan got their next game for the system, which was Pikmin. And then there wouldn't be anything else on the GameCube for another month until the end of November, where they basically reset the system and had basically a second launch for the console in Japan. So on November 21st, not only did Super Smash Bros. Melee launch for the GameCube, but Nintendo also released brand new colours of the system as well. So they also introduced the Jet Black and Spice Orange variations of the GameCube. And they shifted another 200,000 consoles, and Smash actually sold 358,000 copies in its first week on sale, and managed to sell over 1 million in just 2 months' time, which was a new record for Nintendo. So this second launch for the system really already gave it a new lease of life, which is exactly what they were hoping would happen. So things were actually going fairly smoothly over in Japan, but in America it was another story. Obviously, the terrorist attack in September put a spanner in Nintendo's works, along with the entire rest of the country. So the country was obviously in shock for what happened on 9/11. The stock market was down, the economy was down, but Nintendo had to press on somehow. They had a new console to launch. So the ad campaign, with a budget of $75 million, went ahead mostly as planned. There were some plans for parties to take place in September, but they were delayed until October because of the events, obviously. So In October, they did actually host some parties in Hollywood with a bunch of celebrities in hopes of trying to change Nintendo's image and make them more of an adult-focused company instead of a child-friendly one, even though in Japan they were still making games for children and families, but America really wanted to change that perception. They also announced something called Cube Club, which were special week-long preview events sponsored by MTV, which would take place all across the country between September the 28th and November the 17th. And at those events as well, all the attendees would actually get one of these. These are special preview DVDs for the GameCube, and this actually contained a bunch of trailers for upcoming games for the GameCube, as well as some interactive PC features like downloadable wallpapers and icons and everything like that. And in terms of the launch games, the US actually fared much better than Japan. They actually had 12 games available at launch, and they were Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, Wave Race, All-Star Baseball 2002, Batman Vengeance, Crazy Taxi, Dave Mirra's Freestyle BMX 2, Disney's Tarzan Untamed, Madden NFL 2002, NHL Blitz 2002, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. And now with Japan and America out of the way, in 2002, Nintendo turned their attention to Europe. And the European release day was the 3rd of March, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened before the release here as well. So it actually had a similar marketing campaign compared to America, including the Cube Club parties as well. They were also trying to remove Nintendo's kiddie image from Europe as well, and there was lots of post-launch parties here in the UK as well. There was invite and press events, and if you went to one of these press events, you were actually given a goodie bag along with a shirt, a magazine, and one of these promo CDs here as well, which was very different to the DVD that you got in America. This one actually came on a GameCube-sized disc, which is really cool. So if we open this up here, this was actually a lot of people's first sight of what a GameCube game would actually look like up close. And you could put this in the computer and watch preview videos and download wallpapers and see screenshots of all the upcoming games for the system. And I remember actually getting this before the console came out here in the UK as well, and I was just enamored by the pre-release screenshots of Star Fox Adventures. That was the game I was most looking forward to, and I still find it really nostalgic to go back and put this disc in and to see just how different it was to the final release, and just to remember the weird menu system for this and just how excited I was at the time. In Belgium and France as well, they also had the Cube Club parties, and lots of celebrities around Europe also attended these events too. And surprisingly, before the launch of the console, there was already a price cut. It went down to £129 here in the UK, down from the initial release price of £150, and this was in direct response to Microsoft and their Xbox console, which had recently dropped in price from their launch price of £299 down to £199, and because of this steep drop immediately, and I remember some people actually bought the Xbox here on day one, and they actually got a £100 voucher that they could spend on 2 new games for their new system. And also, before the launch of the GameCube here in the UK, in the GameShop Game and Electronics Boutique, they were actually giving out these VHS tapes, and here's my original one from before launch day. And again, just like that preview CD, I remember watching this over and over and over again and just getting so excited about the idea of playing some of these games. They were showing off Sonic Adventure 2, Super Monkey Ball, Luigi's Mansion. I remember Crazy Taxi was on there as well. Basically a lot of stuff that I could have already played on the Dreamcast. I was very excited about playing on the GameCube because I didn't own a Dreamcast at the time. There was so much really exciting stuff, and this video holds a lot of very special memories for me as well. And the GameCube was actually the first console that I ever got on launch day as well, and there's kind of a sad story around that. I basically sold my Nintendo 64 and every single boxed game that I owned for the system in order to get enough money to buy the GameCube on launch. So I got rid of so many amazing games just to get the system, and I could only afford one game, and the game I got at launch was actually Sonic Adventure 2, and I could not have been happier. I absolutely loved the game. But Sonic Adventure 2 was just one of many launch titles here in the UK. We actually got all of the release games that were out in America, minus NFL 2002, and we also got a bunch of additional games, making our launch range up to 20 titles. And the other games that we got here in Europe also included FIFA 2002, Bloody Roar Primal Fury, Burnout 1, Cell Damage, Donald Duck Quack Attack, Driven, ESPN International Winter Sports, Extreme G3, International Superstar Soccer 2, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, which was the one that I chose, and Universal Studios Theme Park Adventure. So that was it for the launch in the UK and Europe, but there was a few more regions that followed shortly after. On the 17th of May, the GameCube made its debut in Australia and New Zealand, and they also had a pre-launch price cut in response to Xbox over there as well. South Korea was the next area to get its launch, and that was on December 14th, 2002. And interestingly, this was the first Nintendo console to be launched in South Korea under Nintendo, because if you remember in the previous episodes, they were all released under a different brand, but by 2002 the laws that prohibited Japanese companies selling in South Korea had been lifted, so Nintendo could release and publish the GameCube over there, just as they did in the rest of the world. The next place was Brazil, and again this was launched officially through Brazil's Nintendo partner called Gradiente, but this one didn't get a price cut and it was very expensive over there at launch, which is a running theme with Nintendo in Brazil. It launched for the equivalent of £157, which is very expensive for that region. And surprisingly, that is it officially worldwide for the release of the GameCube. It didn't come out in any other regions as far as I can see. But there is one more region that I wanted to talk about. Even though it didn't officially get released, there are some leaked documents that show a 2004 release for the GameCube in China under the Nintendo IQUE brand. And this was actually going to be a completely redesigned GameCube system, just like they did with the N64 previously. This was being developed by an outside studio called Broadon, and the development name for this was the Broadon Board 2. And this was a flatter style of GameCube that also had DVD playback functionality too, and the ability to download games over the internet, as well as playing them through GameCube discs, which were planned to be released in China. Obviously, this fell through completely, and Nintendo didn't have any presence in China with the GameCube at all, although they would go on to release an IQUE version of the Game Boy Advance and the DS, so they weren't completely out of the Chinese market. If you're interested in the history of the GameCube and want to find out some more, there's actually some really great resources that have come out in the past few years. There's these Project Dolphin books here by Travis Nicholas, and this one in particular is fascinating because he actually interviewed some developers for the system, and there's some really interesting insights in here, and this one goes into the history of the console along with a breakdown of every single released game too. But if you're interested in the development of the GameCube console itself and the hardware, I definitely recommend the GameCube Anthology book here by Geeksline. This one goes into loads of technical detail about how the system was made, how the different chips were manufactured, all of the different versions of the console, and everything else you could possibly want to know. And if you want to do some reading online as well, there's a massive, fascinating blog post called A Dolphin's Tale, The Story of the GameCube by Emily Rogers, and this goes into every bit of information you could possibly want to know, right from the start, like I was talking about with ArtX, all the way through to the release of the system and beyond, and it is a fascinating read and there's a lot to sink your teeth into. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I've been kind of struggling to make this one because I've got a cold at the minute, so I apologise if I sounded a little bit different to normal. And we're also suffering from a heat wave here in the UK as well, so a double whammy on this episode, but I got through it somehow. If you want to see the previous history video and learn all about the Nintendo 64, click up here, and I'll see you all again very soon for the development and release of the Nintendo Wii, and that one is so fascinating, so I really hope you subscribe, and look forward to that one very soon. Goodbye.